So before we begin painting over the stencil, you're going to want that leftover grid paper that you saved from earlier when you peeled the stencil off of it. We're going to use the waxy side of that. If you had a blue stencil, then your waxy paper is going to be white. You just don't want to use the grid side, you want the waxy side. And then you're going to take your clothespin dabber and you're going to dip it into your cup of paint. And then you want to dab up and down onto this waxy paper a few times because you don't want too much paint on the sponge, otherwise it'll cause it to bleed underneath your stencil. So after you've dabbed onto the wax paper, then you're going to dab up and down over the stencil. And again, we want to dab up and down, so pouncing up and down. Do not brush from side to side. When you brush, it pushes the paint underneath your stencil. So you're going to dab up and down. Now, if you start to need more paint, you can always just kind of come back to this wax paper, get a little bit more, since it's kind of building up there. And then if that's dry, then just go back to your paint cup. But each time you go to your paint cup, you want to dab on the wax paper again because you don't want too much paint on the brush. So you're going to dab up and down, fill in all your stencil. Just be careful you don't dab out here and get any on your wood. Now this is a part that you'll want to move through fairly quickly. If you're doing this with a friend, you won't want to just stop and chat during the painting step because you want to remove the stencil while the paint is still wet. If you let it dry, it can dry as one layer, and then when you pull your stencil up, the paint can peel up with the stencil. Now if you're doing multiple colors for your stencil, go ahead and finish out all the parts of your stencil that would say use this color. So if you were alternating like tan, white, tan, then we would go ahead and do this one and just, keep on moving down the line with this paint color. And then when you're done, you can just take your foam out and you can sub in your next piece of foam so you have a clean one for the next color. So we can go ahead and do this one white or gray or whatever we're doing, and you'll just change out your pieces as you need them. So normally we would go ahead and finish our entire stencil. I'm just going to show you the next step, which will be pulling the stencil up. So we're just going to remove this like this. Now, depending on your stencil, there may be some pieces that still stay stuck down, like the insides of letters or images. So in this case, we have this S in the middle here. And so we're going to use our tack to remove that. And what we want to be careful about is we don't want to use the tack and go right along the edge of the stencil and try and get underneath it and lift it, because then we're going to scratch our paint. So we want to go in the actual stencil itself, like right in the center of it, not on the edge. And we want to stick this in here and lift it up. This is a real skinny one. And then we'll go ahead and grab this and pull it up. And then we have here this little apostrophe, so it's the same thing. We're going to stick it in the middle, not along the edge. Get this to lift up. You might find that once it's lifted, if it's a really tiny piece, it's easier then, rather than to try and get in with your finger where you might smudge your paint, is if you can then just get the tack underneath it where you're not touching it because it's already lifted up. Then you can lift it up higher to grab it with your fingers. Stencils that are on the larger side like this one, or stencils that might have more detailed painting, also like this one where you're doing lots of color changes, will have slits cut into them in various sections so that you can remove the stencil as you're painting, because we don't want the paint to dry as you pull the stencil up. So you'll see little cuts made where it's separating different sections. You can't see it on the video, but you'll see it on your stencil. So if you have that, instead of finishing the other areas that we want to do white, we're going to go ahead and just remove this portion of the stencil since we're finished painting, to make sure that this paint's not going to pull up with the stencil. And then something else to keep in mind is because of the slits that are in here, technically if you paint over those slits, some paint could seep through. Because it's not a solid stencil and it's slit there. So try and minimize painting over the slit just to prevent any possible paint from seeping through. So here I see that there's a cutout where the Santa is going to be removed, and I still wanted to do him white, so I left the white sponge on, but now I want to do some red. And so I'm going to go ahead, even though I'm planning to use white in other areas here, I'm still going to go ahead and change this out and finish out the red on his hat so that I can go ahead and pull that stencil out as soon as I'm done. If you're finding it hard to do two colors next to each other because you don't have a real steady hand, you can always, if you've got some Q-tips, you can always use that to get in there to dab closely next to a different color. But the same process, if you dab your Q-tip into your paint, just always dab a few times onto that wax paper first because you don't want too much paint on the Q-tip when you dab it onto your stencil.